Welcome to the B3 Guidelines Guideline Leader training. In this training, we will describe the role and responsibilities of the Guideline Leader during design and construction for projects using Minnesota's B3 Guidelines. We will walk through how to fulfill these responsibilities by demonstrating how to navigate the B3 Guidelines tracking tool, which is used to document project information, describing how the Guideline Leader can coordinate design and construction phase compliance, walking through the process for reviewing project team submissions at each design phase, and describing the appropriate use of variances, which can provide accommodations to the guideline requirements and/or documentation schedule to account for unique project constraints. The information described in this training can also be found in our detailed guidance documents at the URL shown here. Let's begin by defining the role of Guideline Leader and discussing how they contribute to the B3 Guidelines process. Guideline leaders manage their project team's submission for the B3 Guidelines. This management is crucial to incorporating the B3 Guidelines into the design process and submitting project documents in a timely manner. Guideline leaders have 5 main responsibilities: project setup, coordinating design and construction phase compliance, completing guideline documentation, reviewing phase submissions, and coordinating and reviewing variance requests. To successfully fulfill these responsibilities, Guideline leaders should have strong management skills as well as a strong understanding of their individual project. It can also be helpful in this role to have experience with sustainable building design or rating system documentation. While Guideline leaders do not need to have deep knowledge within every category of the B3 Guidelines, it is helpful to have a general understanding of the design strategies, compliance thresholds, and documentation required by the program. This familiarity can be gained through previous project experience or by learning throughout the course of their individual project. Although there can only be one Guideline leader on a project at a time, team members can transition in and out of the role. For example, the Guideline leader for the design phase may be the project architect, while the Guideline leader for the construction phase may be a construction administrator. The Guideline leader can also serve additional roles on the project team. Next, let's look at how the Guideline leader uses the online B3 Guidelines tracking tool to perform their responsibilities. Compliance with the B3 Guidelines is documented within the B3 Guidelines tracking tool. The B3 Guidelines tracking tool is an online project file where project teams will submit compliance documentation at each project phase, from pre-design through 10 years of building operation. This file also shows information like the current progress of the project, specific guideline requirements, and assignments for each team member. Within the B3 Guidelines tracking tool, each project team member, as assigned by the Guideline leader, can access the project file with their own login information. B3 Guideline administrators can also access the project file. Before the B3 Guidelines tracking tool can be used by the project team, it is the Guideline leader's responsibility to initiate project setup. This should be done as soon as possible. To initiate project setup, Guideline leaders should fill out the appropriate form on the B3 Guidelines website, which will depend on whether their project is state-funded or fee-applied. When filling out the project intake form, Guideline leaders will report the expected size and scope of their project. This will inform which guidelines appear on the B3 Guidelines tracking tool project dashboard. For example, a project with no educational spaces would not display guidelines specifically for educational spaces on the tracking tool dashboard. If a project team is unsure of their project's exact scope, potentially relevant guidelines will be included until confirmed otherwise. It may take up to 5 business days for the project file to be established. Once the project file has been set up, the Guideline leader will receive a welcome email with their login information. When you log into the tracking tool, you will see a list of all B3 projects you are a part of. For example, this team member is a member of one project. In addition to the project's name and address, you can also see the project's current phase within the tracking tool, which guideline version the project is using, and when the project file was last modified. The project file also shows any immediate action items that are preventing the project from meeting compliance documentation requirements in red. Several links are also provided. The first link accesses the project dashboard, where detailed project information is tracked. Other options include adding or assigning team members or accessing the current phase report. These last two options can also be accessed from within the project dashboard. Let's go into the project dashboard. The project dashboard is the main resource for your project and is where all guideline documentation is stored. The row of buttons at the top open the project editor, which includes information about team members, roles, assigned action items, and other project details. The rows of the dashboard include all the applicable guidelines for the project. These are divided into the 5 categories of performance management, site and water, energy and atmosphere, indoor environmental quality, and materials and waste. Each category can be expanded or collapsed using the +- symbol. Each row represents an individual guideline with a link to read the guideline that accesses the complete guideline language, information about the intent of the guideline, submittal requirements, and additional resources, including templates and worksheets. Each guideline can also be expanded to show its component parts, including the team member who is responsible for documentation and whether that part is required or optional. Optional parts of guidelines can be listed as pursued or not pursued based on design team inputs. You can use the drop-down on the left to expand the grid to show all action items or all guidelines. The columns of the grid show each phase: pre-design, design, final design, and closeout. Clicking on the phase summary report accesses a report showing all information submitted for that phase. Once the project file has been established and the Guideline Leader understands how to navigate the B3 Guidelines tracking tool, it is the responsibility of the Guideline Leader to add team members to the project file. To add a team member, click on the Team button near the top of the screen. Clicking this button will open the Team tab within the project editor. From here, Guideline Leaders can view current team members as well as add a new team member. Current team members are shown under the heading Team Members. There are currently 2 active team members under this project. To add a new team member, enter the email address, first name, last name, and company of the person you want to add. When these fields are complete, click the Add button at the bottom of the pop-up window. Adding team members to the project file will send them an email invitation, which they can use to access the project file with their own login information. Make sure each person is aware they will be receiving an email inviting them to join. It is also the responsibility of the Guideline Leader to assign team members to roles within the tracking tool, such as Energy Leader, Civil Leader, and others. Each team member can play multiple roles or no roles, as long as all roles within an open action item in the current project phase are filled. The project dashboard shows the roles that have responsibilities during the current project phase. In this project, some roles required for the current project phase are already filled, such as the Guideline Leader. However, other roles with responsibilities in the project phase, like the Architectural Leader, are still unassigned. To assign a role, click on the Roles button near the top of the screen. Clicking this button will open the Roles tab within the project editor. From here, the Guideline Leader can see roles that are currently filled and unfilled. Roles highlighted in yellow with an unspecified team member require the Guideline Leader to assign a team member to them. To assign someone to a role, select a team member from the drop-down list. Roles highlighted in gray, such as the agency contact, cannot be changed by the Guideline Leader. Only the B3 administrators can assign this role. Keep in mind that different roles have different relevant responsibilities, so team members should be assigned roles according to their experiences and skill set. Role setting is important to discuss with your project team. Another key responsibility of the Guideline Leader is to provide and update the project schedule. Updating the schedule allows for accurate project tracking and helps the project team meet their deadlines. To update the schedule, expand the Guideline Performance Management information within the Performance Management category on the project dashboard. Click on the icon to the right of the Guideline component part Schedule to open the Schedule Editor. This will open the Schedule Editor pop-up window, where the Guideline Leader can enter consecutive deadlines for the start and end of each phase. The schedule can also be viewed, but not edited, from the Schedule button at the top of the screen on the project dashboard. Now, let's dig into how the Guideline Leader performs their responsibilities coordinating design and construction phase compliance. One of the Guideline Leader's biggest tasks is coordinating design and construction phase compliance. The Guideline Leader must ensure that their project team understands the B3 Guideline requirements, incorporates them into their design, and submits complete and timely compliance documentation to the B3 Guidelines tracking tool. To successfully do this, the Guideline Leader will need to prioritize communication about B3 Guidelines compliance with their project team. The Guideline Leader will also need to communicate with other parties, such as the B3 Guidelines administrators, the project owner, and the project's agency contact, the representative from the state that reviews and approves project submissions. The Guideline Leader will also coordinate variance requests and manage submissions, as well as serve as a resource for other project team members. Each of these facets of the Guideline Leader position is critical. We will now discuss what actions Guideline Leaders can take to facilitate each. The Guideline Leader should proactively communicate with their project team about compliance with the B3 Guidelines. This may include coordinating a B3 Guidelines kickoff meeting to review the requirements, member roles and responsibilities, optional guidelines, and logistics associated with the B3 Guidelines compliance. This may also include ensuring that the B3 Guidelines are being regularly discussed at project meetings and that compliance progress is being tracked regularly. Throughout the project, the Guideline Leader should support an interdisciplinary participatory team approach and work to coordinate across disciplines. The Guideline Leader should also proactively communicate with other parties, such as the project owner and B3 Guidelines administrators. For example, the Guideline Leader should make sure that the project owners understand the B3 Guidelines requirements and how these will impact the project. Communications and check-ins with the B3 Guidelines administrators should be organized by the Guideline Leader as needed. While some communication needs will vary by project, potential reasons for contact with the B3 Guidelines administrators could be changes in the project status, decisions about the project scope, which will impact required guidelines, an SB 2030 strategy meeting to confirm the list of strategies under evaluation for the on-site energy target, elevation of questions from project team members, and questions not answered by the online resources available. All communication with B3 Guidelines administrators should be sent to the email guidelines@b3mn.org, where it will be directed to the appropriate person. The Guideline Leader is responsible for coordinating project team variance requests and managing submissions. This may include working with the project team to identify requirements that may require a full or provisional variance. Variances provide accommodations for guideline requirements and/or documentation schedule in order to account for unique project constraints, such as a programmatic conflict or a technological limitation. This will be discussed in more detail in a few minutes. The Guideline Leader is also responsible for setting and enforcing deadlines for submitting documentation to the B3 Guidelines tracking tool. While some guidelines will benefit from preliminary calculations, Final calculations and sign-off on a guideline should occur at the end of the phase for the most current information. It is reasonable to expect full documentation to be completed within 30 days of the phase ending date, and phases that have not been fully completed and signed by the guideline leader and agency contact within 60 days of the phase ending date will be considered overdue by B3 Guidelines administrators. The guideline leader should serve as a resource for project team questions about the B3 Guidelines requirements and sustainable design strategies. This may require sharing knowledge directly with team members, coordinating a question and answer session with the B3 Guidelines administrators and relevant project team members, and connecting team members with additional resources such as the B3 Guidelines training manuals or B3 Guidelines website. The training and education page shown here is available on the B3 Guidelines website. It is also the responsibility of the guideline leader to maintain continuity within the project team. Guideline leaders should provide new team members or team members transitioning into a new role with context, as well as update team member roles within the B3 Guidelines tracking tool. Now, let's discuss how the guideline leader uses the B3 Guidelines tracking tool to comply with correct guideline documentation. The B3 Guidelines tracking tool requires appropriate documentation within each project phase, as well as for each guideline being pursued by the project. To identify and complete documentation for guidelines that require an action, navigate to the project dashboard. As seen in the legend, a red outline shows when documentation is required for each guideline. The current phase is highlighted in yellow, and boxes with a yellow triangle and exclamation point are items that have been assigned to you to complete. To access and complete your assigned guideline, click on the action item icon. This will open a pop-up where you can provide your documentation. Boxes that are colored yellow are required fields during the current project phase. Boxes that are blue are calculated fields. These boxes are not directly editable, but rather are calculated from other user inputs. These fields may use data that is entered in other guidelines, potentially by other team members. To learn about how each field calculates its values, hover over the question mark located next to the input box. Gray boxes are fields that are not applicable during the current phase, but are required in a different one. To learn more about when it is required, hover over the associated question mark. Once the necessary inputs have been provided, it's time to check for compliance by clicking on the green Check for Compliance button at the bottom of the input menu. If the inputs provided are compliant, you can choose whether or not to sign off on the guideline using the checkbox at the bottom of the window. If you need to double-check an input, you can save and close without signing off on your submission. This will continue to appear as an action item on the project dashboard, but your work will be saved. If you are ready to finalize your submission, you can sign off on it. This will cause it to show as complete on the project dashboard for that phase. If an unexpected design change affects the inputs, you'll still be able to edit them after acknowledging the warning. You can then re-sign off with the current date. Completed guidelines can continue to be edited up until all guidelines are complete for that phase, and it is locked for editing. Sometimes, the inputs you have provided may be flagged as not compliant. The reason why a guideline is not compliant will be shown near the top of the window in a red box. In this case, you and the project team should work together to fix the problem. For example, this non-compliant will be solved when more of the budget is set aside for SB 2030 compliance and operation. To fix the problem later, click the green Save and Close button. Note that this will not sign off on the guideline. It simply saves your work so you can go back and fix it later. If the problem requires a variance to solve or must be labeled as not compliant, click the red link labeled Apply for a Variance Not Compliant. More information about the role of variances and non-compliant designations are available on the B3 website and later in this video. A couple other notes about the tracking tool. It is possible to open any guideline at any phase by clicking on the relevant box, though you will get a notice for guidelines that are not required at that phase, guidelines in a future phase, and guidelines that are not assigned to you. You can complete and sign off on guidelines in future phases, for example, if the B3 documentation is lagging behind the actual project schedule. You can also complete and/or sign off on guidelines that are not assigned to you after acknowledging the warning message at the top of the page. Your name will be used for the signature. If responsibility for the guideline should be permanently assigned to you, this can be done through the project editor, the row of buttons at the top of the project dashboard. Next, let's talk about the phase review and approval process, which is performed by both the guideline leader and the agency contact. There are 4 phases during design and construction where documentation is required in the B3 Guidelines tracking tool: pre-design, design, final design, and closeout. Phase review is a step that helps ensure the information provided at each phase is complete and accurate. During phase review, the project's guideline leader and agency contact will review the submitted information for the current phase via the phase summary report. This step helps identify potential issues before it's too late in the design process to change them. Phase review begins automatically once all the guidelines in a phase have been completed and signed off on. When this happens, the phase is locked and cannot be edited. The project's guideline leader provides the first round of review to confirm that, to the best of their knowledge, the information submitted is complete and accurate. This review is followed by the B3 Guidelines administrators, who provide a limited review of specific inputs, including SB 2030 and variance requests. The agency contact provides the final review of the phase summary report, including any pending variances. They too are confirming that the information submitted is complete and accurate to the best of their knowledge, and determining whether variance requests made by the project team are deemed acceptable by the agency, state entity, or non-state organization they are representing. When a phase summary report is ready for review, an automated email will be sent from the B3 Guidelines administrators. In the project dashboard, the project status will be listed as Ready for Guideline Leader in the upper right, and a yellow action item icon will be visible for the phase summary report. Clicking on this action item will open the phase summary report pop-up window. Once the report is open, the guideline leader will review the submitted documentation for accuracy and completeness. The phase summary report includes all the information submitted by the project team at that phase. Through the phase review process, guideline leaders should ensure that all uploaded documents meet the B3 requirements with a level of completeness that is appropriate for the current phase. If the guideline leader believes any information provided is incomplete or inaccurate, they should follow up with the project team to resolve the issues. If changes are required, the guideline leader will need to unlock the phase for editing. This is done by clicking the bright red Unlock link at the top of the phase summary report. Questions or concerns about the acceptability of phase summary report submissions can be sent to the B3 Guidelines administrators. Once all materials have been reviewed and all issues have been resolved, you're ready to turn in the phase summary report by clicking the green Submit button at the bottom of the screen. This will pass the phase summary report along to the B3 Guidelines administrators and agency contact for review. The phase review process also includes addressing any pending variances. Guideline leaders should review all variance requests to ensure they meet program requirements and accurately represent project information. They should also identify opportunities to switch from a full variance to a provisional variance, a temporary measure that enables the project team to keep working toward meeting the guideline during future phases. However, the guideline leader is not responsible for formally approving or rejecting variance requests. The final approval or rejection of variances is made by the agency contact. To view pending variance requests, identify guidelines that say Variance Pending in the top right corner of the guideline. From here, the guideline leader can review the project team's justification, which is shown in the variance notes. If the variance request meets both the program requirements and accurately represents the project, continue the process of reviewing and submitting the phase summary report. If the variance is later approved by the agency contact, no further action is needed. If the variance request is rejected by the Guideline Leader, B3 Guidelines Administrators, or agency contact, the phrase should be unlocked for editing, and the project team will need to resolve the issue. The Guideline Leader should work with relevant team members to make adjustments. This could involve adjusting the design to meet the B3 requirement, resubmitting the variance request with additional detail, or requesting a provisional variance with the goal of adjusting the design in later phases to better meet the intent of the B3 requirement. If the variance was requested for a guideline outside of the project scope, such as a site-related guideline for an interior renovation project, then the B3 Guidelines Administrator should be contacted to see if it can be handled outside of the variance process. If the Guideline Leader is unsure or unable to determine if a variance should be accepted, please also contact the B3 Guidelines Administrators for a second opinion. For our final topic, we will cover variances in greater detail. Variances play an important role in the B3 guidelines to address unique project constraints. The B3 guidelines differ from other rating systems in that it primarily consists of a set of required measures for all projects, rather than a menu of optional sustainability strategies. Due to the variability of B3 projects, some may require adaptations to the performance thresholds and/or documentation schedule. The B3 guidelines allow the use of variances to provide this accommodation under certain circumstances. Two types of variances are available for project teams to use. The first is a provisional variance. Provisional variances are designed for projects that are ready to move on to the next phase, but cannot currently complete all required guidelines. Provisional variances are temporary and only apply to the phase they are requested in. If the issue preventing guideline completion persists for multiple phases, the provisional variance must be re-requested at each phase. However, provisional variances cannot be requested during the last phase a guideline is required. At that time, the guideline must be completed, or a full variance or non-compliant designation must be requested. The second type of variance is a full variance. Unlike provisional variances, a full variance is permanent. Full variances can be requested for programmatic reasons when guideline requirements interfere with the intended use, or program, of the building or site. Full variances can also be requested due to technological limitations, when available technologies or methodologies do not enable the project to meet B3 requirements. When requesting a full variance, the project team must pursue creative solutions to meet the intent of the guideline as much as possible. Full variances should not be requested for the following reasons. They will not be considered based on budgetary or project schedule constraints, nor will they be considered for requirements missed by the project team that cannot be addressed at later phases. Meeting the B3 guidelines may require adjustments to the standard design and construction processes used by the project team. This is not an accepted justification for a variance. Having a small or regular site is not an automatic reason for a variance, though these projects may choose to follow the small buildings and/or small sites methods, which better account for the limitations of small projects. Guidelines that are recommended rather than required do not need variances. Project teams can just choose to not pursue these guidelines. Finally, variances should not be used for guidelines that are unrelated to the project scope. Instead, they should be communicated to the B3 Guidelines Administrators so they can be removed from the project dashboard. If the project team can't document compliance with a guideline and there is no satisfactory reason why a variance should be considered, the project will be designated as not compliant with the guideline. This designation is only available at the last phase the guideline is required. Before that, the project team should use provisional variances while attempting to solve the issue and only pursue non-compliant status as a last resort. All non-compliant designations are shown publicly on the B3 Case Studies database, as shown on the image in the right. Variance requests and non-compliant designations are handled within the B3 Guidelines tracking tool. First, the project team submits the variance request. Next, the request is reviewed by the project's Guideline Leader, the B3 Guidelines administrators, and the agency contact, who determines whether to approve or reject the request. For provisional variances, the request must clearly identify the reason the variance is required and describe next steps for complying with the guideline in later phases. A request for a full variance must identify the reason for the variance and describe how it meets one of the program's allowed justifications. It must describe how the project team exhausted reasonable alternative approaches and explored creative solutions to maintain the intent of the guideline. It must also identify a modified performance level and/or compliance method that will be pursued by the project team. For not compliant designations, the request should describe why this designation is necessary. For any type of request, supporting documentation should be provided as needed. Here is a good example of a request for a provisional variance. The project team describes the reason the variance is needed, that they haven't been able to achieve compliance with the B3 daylight requirements during an early design stage. To meet the requirements, they need to increase daylight access. They are requesting a provisional variance so they have more time to redesign windows and other natural light features in their building, with the intent that the constructed building will meet the guideline requirements. Now, let's look at a sample of a full variance. The reason the variance is needed is clearly stated. Due to the technological limitations of local markets in rural Minnesota, they cannot meet the required recycling rate. Next, they describe how they made every reasonable effort to meet the intent of the guideline, engaging a waste diversion consultant and exploring creative solutions like supplying gypsum board directly to a farm operator for use as a soil amendment. Lastly, they identify their modified approach and performance level, maximizing recycling rates for all waste streams with local facilities or markets through on-site sorting and regular status checks at construction meetings to achieve high diversion rates for these materials, though not meeting the overall B3 diversion requirement. Finally, let's look at some examples of unacceptable requests for full variances. The first identifies the problem, but doesn't describe the specifics or propose an alternate solution. This should be rejected so that a more detailed variance request can be submitted. The second is requesting a full variance for an unacceptable reason, which is project schedule constraints. In addition, it does not describe specifics or next steps. This should be rejected, and ideally daylight modeling should be conducted to help the project become compliant. The third is also an unacceptable reason. In this case, a requirement missed by a project team that cannot be addressed later. This should be rejected and labeled non-compliant. As always, questions about variances can be directed to the B3 Guidelines administrators. This concludes the Guideline Leader training, where we have covered the Guideline Leader's 5 main responsibilities: project setup, coordinating design and construction phase compliance, completing guideline documentation, phase review and approval, and variance coordination and review. To learn more about the B3 programs and tools, please visit our website or contact the B3 program administrators. Thank you.